Are you fed up with printing out exercise programs? Or horror, drawing them? Solve every exercise prescription issue you can think of using Rehab My Patient. Thousands of pictures, videos of every movement you can dream up. Send by email or WhatsApp, translate into different languages at the click of a button. But don't take our word for it. Sign up for a 3-month free trial now. Just go to rehabmypatient.com/physio matters.
Daniel Moore, welcome to Chewing It Over. What profession makes the best MSK clinicians?
I'd have to say chiropractors. You know that, Jack.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'm excited to debate that with you. Me and you off air and also knowing a bit of each other. We met at the BCA conference in person recently. And I think that and this is where you can correct me if I'm wrong or add to this, is that we both have an opinion that in time, a quality contemporary MSK clinician calling from the same evidence and drawing its own clinical philosophies, caring about reasoning, caring about rehab, might find himself in a similar place, right? But the journeys to get there are going to be naturally different depending on what their background qualifications and the cultural heritage of that profession. And that's the thing we're going to debate on today. So would you challenge that view in terms of a conclusion? And whilst let's then get into those differences, but let's just make sure we're on the same page in terms of those similarities.
I think so. I think that's kind of fair to say that was where we got to. And I think we've had that experience in different guises, haven't we? You know, in different environments, maybe that sport or education or different sectors. I think certainly my lived experience is that when you get to a certain level in MSK, things start to look similar in terms of skill set. And like you said, quite rightly, the evidence that we're calling upon to do different things. So I'd agree with that premise. And like you say, it just depends on that route then, the journey that the clinician takes from, pre-higher education all the way through to that could be X number of years down the road, So I do think that the journey makes a big difference.
Now, one of the things that I found interesting was when I was about to sort of define that premise, I almost then said, imagine someone 10 years qualified that, or 15 years qualified that. And actually, one of the things I want to explore is actually is there a rate of progress or a natural trajectory that gets one there sooner than the other, which we can come back to. Before I forget to, though, could you introduce yourself to the listeners and what you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, sure. My name's Daniel Moore. I'm a chiropractor, and I'm currently the course lead for the chiropractic integrated masters at Teesside University in the northeast of England. I've been here for 4 years developing the degree program, and I've been in the profession since 2009. Done a lot of work in sport and education now, and I'm full-time academic.
Superb. No, thank you. And thanks for coming on. I'm looking forward to getting into this with you. Where to start? I feel like, what do you feel are the things then that would, if we think about what shapes a great MSK clinician these days, what do you think it is about chiropractic that makes that a useful heritage? In fact, let's argue, you make the case for why it might be the best starting point that someone could get.
Well, I think it's kind of because it's, we debate this all the time, not debate it, but we have this discussion all the time because applicants say, well, what's the difference? Why would I want to go down the route of being a physio? Why would I want to go down the route of being a chiropractor? And I think that end destination is probably where I would start with people and say, well, where are you going? And then work out what best resonates with you. And for me, chiropractic is focused on those areas, that neuromusculoskeletal disorder space from the outset. So that's one of the biggest sort of differences in terms of the scope of the profession. And I know we'll get into that kind of that pro and con between having that breadth at an undergraduate level compared to chiropractic. But I think that because it's our focus, obviously tongue in cheek, the original answer, it very much depends on a lot of different things. But as we focus on that from the outset, I think it probably stands us in good stead to create the building blocks that are going to go on to then be that MSK professional and have that scope of practice that sort of sits within that sphere of influence without sort of going over there or going over here. Whereas with physiotherapy, and this isn't a downside, I don't think. I think it's one of the strengths, is that there are different pathways that you could go down and specialize in different routes, MSK just being one of them. So that's kind of the starting point, in basic terms that I kind of view it as is, it depends on your destination.
Yeah, and I think that, so I'm going to try and I mean, it's not as if I'm going to ask and then answer. I can
No,
go
no,
first on any of it. So if you feel like you want to challenge anything I'm saying, then jump in. But I think
entirely.
to make sure I do the physiotherapy profession a service in offering why I feel that physiotherapy is well placed to create great MSK clinicians in time, is that breadth that you describe within a degree of which you could go into respiratory care or more obvious surgical orthopedic type work, the obvious NHS heritage of which you then have that associated within even your training, neuro, means that then depending on, and I think it could well be that it's just then the timeline on this could be really interesting to challenge. But generally, it means then that in the contemporary MSK space, where that initial review definitely involves comprehending masqueraders, comprehending what this isn't, making sure it's MSK. I think that to some extent, that heritage of having that breadth, having been in neurosurgery, having been in a situation where you're in a cardiac rehab environment of which you're needing to work out as to how hard to push or not push for whatever reasons, and to have that depth of very specific physiological insight that isn't associated to MSK, and then bringing that across,
Yeah.
can then really leave you with a great foundation in order to subspecialize. That I would be fearful. Granted, I've not done a chiropractic degree whilst worked with many chiros more than most physios. I haven't seen it, but how, if not through a full 3-year bachelor's and its associated postgraduate rotations, how would chiros match up to that then leaves that decent foundation?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's one of the, being a younger profession, I guess, in the UK, and people may not be aware of the undergraduate model. We're a 4-year undergraduate master's, so it's a 4-year degree program. And we still have a central regulator, the General Chiropractic Council. So all of our education institutions in the UK are regulated by the GCC, and we have education standards that regulate us as primary care, as primary care clinicians. And to achieve that status, the standards do include anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, clinical neurology. So we do all of that general diagnosis stuff in our first, second, and third years to get to a point where we can differentially diagnose, and we do have that kind of, is this for us mentality of, right, is this in our scope of practice, or does it need to be referred to GP? Is this in our scope of practice, or is there another secondary care environment needs to go into? Referral and that awareness of the medical conditions is well within our remit to manage at assessment, but not necessarily manage in terms of treatment further on. So we kind of have that ingrained in our education standards. But I think something that you and I also tended to agree on when we first met is that we could probably do more. And one of the things that we're trying to do at T-Site, we've developed the placement model to get our students out into practice. And one of those environments is the NHS setting, to give our students that broader setting, to give them that little bit more ability to collaborate with others. The World Federation of Chiropractic launched a massive new kind of agenda a few years ago, calling for sort of epic chiropractic, EPIC, sort of evidence-based, person-centered, interprofessional, and collaborative, and that is what makes a modern day clinician and chiropractor. Now, I think we'd probably argue that would also be the principles of a physiotherapist in that space as well. But collaborative being key, that collaborating in those different settings really brings depth to a clinician's understanding of, well, what does that referral look like? Where and patients want it, Jack, don't they? The evidence suggests patients want joined up care. They want more integration. And I think that this kind of thing is really useful to start those conversations to see, well, how best can we work together? And even if we get to the same kind of point, is it okay that we're different? And I think
that's
so.
Right. Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that even if there ends up being a hair's breadth between us in the end. Sometimes that heritage and that cultural background, or especially we'll come to it, I'm sure, that public perception piece of each of them that naturally shapes our interactions and the expectations that we need to manage are different. But again, I don't want to rush us there. Just in the spirit of debate, if I was to think about what you've just described as being this sensible and appropriately regulated, the things that you need to be safe on first contact, to know what's for you and what's not for, etc. And I can imagine that being really well taught. I suppose what I would wonder is, could that ever be appropriately taught by a case study in such a way that if I gave an example from and I was a NAF respiratory student, always massively into MSK, struggled for too long to kind of get my head around why it was worth me knowing it. But one of the things that really assisted me when I realized why I was glad I had that history, that background, those placements, even in my junior rotations, although they were brief until I subspecialized in MSK, is that when I realized the way in which in a respiratory setting, in a respiratory rehab setting, breathlessness, how that affected accessory musculature, how that then affected very vague, weird neurology into the head, things that were presenting as MSK, even in that setting, but I knew were because of apical breathing, etc. That was a very immersive and very respiratory non-MSK setting, of which I then drew that information and joined those dots. That, yes, I could imagine a circumstance in which that might have been taught, but there isn't necessarily a circumstance in which a chiropractor would be in that setting at the moment, because it was a very medical placement and very medical rotation. So I just wanted to throw that to you as to whether or not, how do you, if am I describing something that's a reasonable difference? And if so, how might you mitigate some of the natural immersive learning that physios might get in that space compared to you having to teach it by, say, case study in theory?
Yeah, 100%. And when I started the degree at Teesside, I thought the only way to do it is contextual learning, put people into placement. And traditionally, chiropractic in the past had only had a final year clinical placement on site. So it hadn't had that for those first 3 years, weren't necessarily out in the profession or other professions. And we are moving towards a more contemporary sort of educational paradigm where we are putting students into placement. Our students do go out, chiropractic students, into the local trust, into neuro wards, into physio wards, into sort of the local trust in other guises, onto sort of pre-surgical wards, post-surgical wards, and gaining some of that. And not necessarily every student will go over all of those different areas, but we can bring it back to university and discuss it in context. The other thing that we're doing, being embedded into a health sciences department or school really helps, because the interdisciplinary working that we do multidisciplinary team evenings with physiotherapists, OTs, ODPs, paramedics. We can have those cross-disciplinary discussions to say, how would you deal with this? How would you deal with that? And that simulation space is becoming a lot more, collaborative simulation space is becoming or emerging as kind of a really gold standard way to be able to gain some of this interdisciplinary conversation. So I think we manage it well, in terms of staff as well. We can share staff. We have a medical doctor teaching on our course. We have physiologists teaching physiology. I think a valid criticism of chiropractic in the past is that it sat in a silo on its own. And I just don't think that is a contemporary view of the profession, and that's probably been changing now for 10, 15, 20 years. Okay. But certainly more so now. We have London South Bank University teaching chiropractic embedded in a health sciences school and allied health department. Same with ourselves. We sit within the allied health department, all our first aid, all our trauma stuff. We have a paramedic that comes in and teaches that to our students. So we're starting to have more of that crossover and like I say, just collaborative education, collaborative placement experience. And then we're trying to pull that final year experience together, whereby we have the strength and conditioning students, the sports therapy, everyone working together, cross-referring, learning from each other, and also pulling staff and professionals into that as well. So the more links we can join, I think the more we negate that. But I also am not naive to think that the professions will be able to do better in certain areas because of the nature of the offering that they have. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. That might be okay.
Sure, no, I can understand that. I think the what I've tried to make there is where I think the strength lies in the argument that physios
Mm.
might then have that deeper foundation. However, to just allow myself to weaken my own argument a little in recognizing that in time, what I've just described, there might be someone listening to this who's a few years graduated that'd be like, well, I certainly didn't have a respiratory replacement of which I encountered what Jack's just describing, and those
Mm.
things are becoming, it's more and more of a lottery as to what placements you have. I know that I was fortunate that I'm in a school that still holds a situation where you can have MSK, orthopedic, neurology, respiratory placements, as well as then subspecialties into your third year. That has not been the case even when I graduated in many schools, and certainly is actually not the norm. And therefore, I don't want to romanticize the fact that that is something that anyone would be exposed to as standard under a regulated framework. So we can sometimes be at risk of then describing our own background and personal experience that is not inherent to the course or inherent to the regulated profession. And so that's one of the things that I want to definitely come to with you, is that how much do you feel that there is a within regulated chiropractors and within the schools, there's fewer of your schools than say physio schools, but
Yeah.
how do you feel the standards are being able to maintain to make sure that there is a consistency of what is then known interprofessionally of what it means to be a chiropractor regulated under the GCC?
Yeah, sure. I just broached that. You mentioned something interesting there. If I can just quickly remember what it was before I answer that question. Yeah, no, I'll move on and answer that question in terms of consistency, but then come back to some. Oh, I know what I was going to say. If we look at kind of other areas that we could maybe just counter your point to say that's really useful. I know what I was going to say. I think that really does place physiotherapy well to be situated in the NHS, and we're having to do probably some more work. Although we might have some of the basic competencies to go and work in that environment and integrate into the NHS. I think we've got the kind of academic competencies, but we don't have that cultural experience that physios have because of those placements. And I think that is a downside and probably an advantage for physio. The guidelines that are coming out as well when it comes to MSK, the recent WHO guidelines, only mentioning them because they were so new for non-surgical low back pain in January, promote spinal manipulation. And that isn't an undergraduate skill for physio, but it is for chiro. So we kind of I feel like when we could have this sort of conversation for hours and we're like, well, that's a point for physio, but then we get a point here for chiro. And I don't think that is point scoring in that one's better than the other. It's just there are differences and that's natural.
Yeah.
The GCC have a similar, we have an education committee. I sit on the GCC education committee as a registrant member. It's a statutory committee, the GCC, that regulate education in the UK. We have education visitors, the same as the other regulators that will and have the power to authorize or not authorize certain chiropractic courses in the UK. So like every other PSRB, the GCC do a sort of scrupulous job at ensuring that those standards are maintained. And there's just no leeway on that. It's a statutory regulated duty that they have. So if you are graduating and are registered as a chiropractor in the UK, people can have confidence that those outcomes have been met and those competencies exist.
Yeah, and that's really useful to understand that threshold for competence and safety, for
100%.
assurances, especially when we'll come to interprofessional trust, I'm sure, in a sec. You've already made what I think you'd agree is a really strong suit in terms of a tick on the column for chiropractic over physiotherapy is actually the subspecialism of MSK from the off and being known within the pain and injury space in the primary. So tell us a little bit about why, and add some meat on why that's a real strength to it. What are the key things that within an undergraduate physiotherapy? Sorry, I know it's a master's, but I mean that entry level point for training as chiro. Talk us through, including across manipulation and management in manual therapy skill, as to why that does end up being a sort of strength if we're trying to level peg them against each other.
I think it comes down, if we look at how degrees are kind of formed, it comes down to how much credit you can spend on certain things. We have a little bit more time than physio, being a 4-year undergraduate master's. And because we maybe don't have those other subspecialties, we can spend more time on some of those really key areas like clinical neurology, orthopedics. So if we think about our kind of objective assessment, let's sort of just take sort of practical objective assessment, observation, palpation, gait, orthopedic evaluation, special tests, functional management. We have a module in year 1, 2 modules in year 2, 2 modules in year 3 modules in year 3. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, nearly 120 credits, a year's worth of credits focused on assessment. In its different guises. Now, in terms of MSK assessment, I'd be interested to how much credit is. I think that will be more. That will turn out to be more.
Likely to be,
than in the physio space. So again, it's just due to our specialism. We don't have certain other things that we do have in terms of objective assessment, which I think is a benefit, because our students are then really competent at MSK assessments when it comes to their first day of their clinical year, which is year 4. And they're able to work independently in that MSK environment from the summer of their year 3 under supervision.
And so I'll say this definitely more as devil's advocate, because I have no reason to know that this is the case, really. But I can understand the argument, and I think that to some extent, if I studied it carefully enough, I might find this, is that there might well be in that process that you're describing. It could be one thing to load it as look at all this attention, but there could also be an over-analysis that can occur to that, in which you're potentially training people to examine and scrutinize and consider relevant factors, of which we as physiotherapists, or particularly me as a physiotherapist, might well find that then if I was to indulge the stereotypes of chiropractic, which I think is unfair increasingly these days.
It's useful though
sometimes, but I think what I definitely mean is that, well, how on earth do you manage to do so much education in that space? They must therefore be teaching the relevance of, are they dangling plumb lines off each other all the time? Are they implying that there's some extrasensory palpation skill of which you need to make sure you develop so you can understand where T9 is on T10? Therefore, no wonder there's a lot of credits associated to it. So again, I accept that I might be indulging stereotype there, but how do you mitigate that risk? And is that definitely part of the maturity of the profession?
Well, I think we're just being, I think one thing is we're interrogated by the evidence. So if we were doing things, the GCC education visits, those are not chiropractors. We're regulated by lay individuals as well as chiropractic registrants. So I guess you're getting an objective view there. And if we were sort of straying off course, particularly, the university would look at that. We have very cross-disciplinary review panels of the modules and the courses that we run. So I think we're just trying to spend the time getting undergraduates really good at something, and spending time reviewing the right stuff. And I think that other than to say, it's still guided by the best available evidence, and it's still just trying to get undergraduate students really, really good at a certain skill set, which is challenging because they haven't done it before. And consider all of those things that we've talked about from the pathophysiology side in their objective assessment, to be able to make those really sound determinations of whether it's for them or not. I think that the more time we could spend a career doing CPD around objective assessment and it'd be valid, and we're just trying to cram as much into the undergraduate space as we can.
And that's definitely it, isn't it? It's, of course, you can wash, rinse, repeat, different angles, different cases, different. So it's not as if that. Well, to spend that much time on it, therefore you must be learning something daft. Is not a fair judgment, but it's just one of them things that definitely gets us to a point where I think potentially conversations like this too often devolve. But it'd be stupid for us to not go there a little bit. Is that I think that both professions have some responsibility to clean house. And that to some extent, there is a natural legacy across both professions and all associated MSK professions as to where there may well be mechanisms of practitioners to hide from, say, the evidence or the natural philosophical progressions of the industry at large. And then where the association, interprofessional reputation can sometimes mean that it can suffer. And that can sometimes be that then failure to collaborate or to update yourself on where your similarities are in the primary. But it also means then that if it's an understandable way in which people, if a physiotherapist meets a number of chiropractors in various different circumstances, from letters, from hearsay from patients and stuff, which is sometimes a problem, and vice versa, if indeed it seems that there are very disparate philosophies, then no wonder that then it's not just a stereotype. It's that seems to be sticky and it seems to be valid and there seems to be something to be said for that's the only thing they encounter them on. So as under that responsibility to clean house under both parties, can you give me an insight, and I'm happy to share mine, as to what it is within chiropractic that has then potentially is helping to do that, if indeed you feel it needs it?
Helping to clean house, do you mean? Yeah, I think patient need and becoming more professional over time. I think it's a cultural shift. We come from quite a from a vitalistic background, a very kind of maybe unevidence-based foundation. Back to the 1890s, and that kind of stayed with the profession for some time. And I think that when we started to become regulated in the 90s through into the early 2000s, the profession, certainly in the UK, realized that there was a need to professionalize over that period of time. There was still a lot of people out there, not that chiropractic as a profession back then was the Wild West, but there was still probably less of a professional view of how chiropractic should be. And I think the needs of patients, the needs of society has morphed chiropractic into a much more professional profession now than it was maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Now, if people were, if that's the only contact that they've had with the profession, they may have a bit of a different opinion of it. But certainly over, the contemporary era, since the Chiropractic Act in the late 1990s, we're now in a position where we're a completely different, completely different profession with regulated education, a view towards epic chiropractic and it being evidence-based, underpinned by patient-centered initiatives, interprofessional and collaborative. So I think those things have just evolved into our culture over time, probably as they're evolving through physiotherapy as well. It's harder now, just generally speaking, in healthcare to do wacky stuff. Because people are more wise to it. Patients have a higher demand. It's harder, and why would you want to when there's so much, better attention to the evidence, and that evidence can be mixed. We could do another half hour on what is evidence, but I think that's important to think that certainly I don't give that any time. That side of the coin is just history. We teach it here as history. It's like that's how it is. It's just not part of contemporary chiropractic.
And that evolution is one of the interesting things, is that if it's being taught as that, because that's the thing, if it's being taught as history rather than it being taught as foundational dogmas of which we must comply, of which you wouldn't call it that even if you were trying to teach it, but I just mean that here are foundational techniques and that to challenge them would be to challenge gospel is a very different mechanism. And I know your course and others don't now. I want to make sure that I do give credit then to the same question applied to physiotherapy, of which I think it goes like that definitely goes less answered. Like it's a classic thing for physiotherapy, which has both the size, stature, and time frame. That means that it can sometimes then, you used a really great phrase for it that I wish I could remember easier. Go on, you remind it. Cultural, to
say cultural legitimacy, or
might be. It's better than that. I can't remember. I wish I remembered it. You can't even remember it. But this sort of means that it's just better known in a sense, and therefore sometimes it's easy for a physiotherapy or physiotherapy as a profession to say how do you sort out the cranks on your side of it, whereas within physiotherapy sometimes the mirror being held up doesn't look good, in a sense that sometimes there's a complacency there over the inherent legitimacy, of course, to this, when we know full well in practice that you are just as likely to get some sort of really out their take on a matter that you might disagree with, and that you don't necessarily then have the because of the one of the downsides to not necessarily having that internal tribalism means that then sometimes you're just squeamish and you're just trying to there's no mechanism to squeeze that out. And so I will admit that I think we're on a similar course. I think we have an interesting conversation where it's difficult to know the differences in the percentage of said cranks on either side of that. But I've always said that within physiotherapy, one of the things that's difficult is that imagining that we might have, let's just say, I mean, I can be just uncharitable on a guess for a second and say that, let's say 10% of physiotherapy and 20% of chiropractors are pretty nutty and we disagree with their clinical reasoning practices, etc. That's still a hell of a lot more physiotherapists than it is chiropractors by design of how percentages work on a macro number, in that we've got 67,000 physiotherapists compared to, I forget, 2,500, 3,000 chiros?
3,738, something like that.
So
nearly 4,000.
The percentages are significantly different there. And obviously I'm guessing at it, but I think that it'd be remiss if we missed it. But similarly, that is where almost the boring part of the conversation is these days, if indeed we're looking to raise standards. So I know we need to wrap up, but one thing I definitely wanted to ask you then is that in timeline, do you think then that if you've got a chiropractic undergraduate and a physiotherapy undergraduate coming straight through without any of the previous life experience, let's age match them at 18 or something like that, then do you think that the person that we agreed would end up being the sort of convergence within later into their career? Do you think that chiros get there sooner?
That is so. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It might be that they get there at the same time because they might not be savvy to the same opportunities that physio would be for that cultural legitimacy reason. You know, it probably took me a lot longer to get into. You know, I ended up going down. You're getting into Sunday league football. You know, doing my trauma first aid course to become an FA medical tutor, then getting into sort of women's Premier League, whereas a physio might get that opportunity straight away because they're a physio. Why wouldn't we have a physio? You know, it's like a chiropractor. I've got to do a bit more work to be able to sort of get the cultural understanding and sort of carve out my kind of my use in that space. So I don't know the answer. I think that, you know, the opportunities exist for both. I think for undergrads, you've got to put yourself in the right place. You've got to give yourself opportunity and you've got to get after it, whether you're a physio or a chiropractor. I think you have to offer your time up and understand that you are not the finished article yet and never will be. You've just got to kind of progress. And I really do think that in the spaces that I work in and the people that I speak to, collaboration is just really key. We have to give people the benefit of the doubt. We have to, you know, stop the kind of throwing stones and start to work with people and turn the focus round to patients rather than ourselves. I think that's the big message that it's not about us. It's not about physiotherapy or chiropractic. It's about what this burden of disease from MSK is catastrophically affecting society. How do we deal with that better rather than us fight about what happened 100 years ago? And I do think we're both well placed to what is that? Have you done?
That is brilliant. I didn't do that. What was that?
What was that?
That's just your phone wanting to celebrate your point. I honestly don't know what's happened there, but that's brilliant.
Even know what
that's
is.
The way to go out in a flourish. Yeah, brilliant.
So I think that collaborative piece is just so key. We talked about it before. You know, just a starting point. Speak, learn what you don't know, and find a way forward. And maybe people give people the benefit of the doubt, knowing that we can probably trust the regulators to know that if you meet a physio, they're probably a good person who's trying to help patients, and if you meet a chiropractor, they're probably good people trying to help patients.
Oh, I love that. I mean, you've got far more faith in your regulator than I have in mine, but we can come to that another day. And that'll get me in trouble with said regulator. But as a general rule, in our case, great on the safety side, but lacking on the quality side, might be to do with the breadth of which they need to serve compared to yours, of which I have some jealousy. So another conversation for another day. Thank you so much for your time, mate.
It's
really
been a pleasure.
Appreciate it. And I think that I've come to a similar conclusion in a sense, not just from this conversation, is that potentially chiropractic in these days to start in a better spot and a better footing, but then hit some treacle in terms of getting itself going because of the opportunities. So they might get there at the same place. Very interesting if chiropractors then do have better opportunity and better access to more breadth. Can physiotherapy then improve its undergraduate access in MSK to mean that it doesn't end up too far behind? Otherwise, it might well be that then it starts lagging in terms of the pursuit of that shared expertise that we end up coming to. But that's, again, one for another day. Thanks so much for your time, mate. Where can people just find out a little bit more about you or to follow you on socials and stuff?
I am. I'm on social media, Twitter, I think, and Mr. Daniel B. Moore. But I'm sure we can put this out, and I'll tag myself in things. And if people want to get in touch, by all means, do so.
Yeah, and LinkedIn as well. We had a first back and forth, didn't we, on LinkedIn after the conference?
On LinkedIn as well, so people can find me and connect. I think that's the key. Neither of us were looking to find answers today, where we would just start conversations.
No, exactly. No, it's great, and I look forward to further contributions from you, your team, and I think it's exciting for me to try hopefully platform some of the work you guys are doing at Teesside, which is very multi and interdisciplinary, which is great.
Happy to.
Glad to have got things going, mate. All right, take care.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Cheers, buddy.
Cheers. Bye, Jack.
Here at Physio Matters, we think physio matters. Become a member today and access over 500 webinars, get free tickets to shows and access new content instantly. Access at home, work, or on a ferry to ensure your CPD is all smooth sailing. Physio-matters.com. More content than you can take through customs.